have been professionally otherwise occupied with the building of Europe, and more specifically for a decade as an advisor to the political director to the Council of Europe, to the exporting or bringing about an understanding of democracy and civil society in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. So you gave one hat, but I have two. Consequently, the notion of trying to reconcile the European never again with the new Jewish never again is something that cuts right through me, and there may be moments in which I am perhaps myself schizophrenic, or at least I try to understand both sides of what is a complex, very complex situation today. Well, first of all, I must tell you I'm an intellectual historian, not a philosopher. That means I sort of catch butterflies or look at them as they fly. I'm not an entomologist. I'm not very good in early modern history and philosophy, and therefore I will not be able to trace back to either Locke or Grotius some of the concepts I'll be presenting you in the next few minutes. And I apologize for this, but it will also, I have an excuse in a sense. I'm dealing with the post-war period, and when you start after 1945, there was certainly a shared feeling across Europe that there was a tabula rasa, that none of the great philosophers of the past could have imagined in any way, shape, or form that Europe could have done so much as a double suicide to itself in less than 50 years. Not to mention, of course, the Shoah or the Holocaust. So it's not so much a notion of time decline, but of a Europe that has to rebuild itself from scratch, and that then uses concepts that I would almost call going through a blender or being put into a pressure cooker or flattened out, so that maybe what comes from the 16th century, what comes from the 17th century or the 18th century gets put into a kind of hugely dense mass to try to see where the pieces can be picked up. The second element is, of course, that if we look after the war, Second World War, Europe is just one piece. It is no longer the world. When you have been discussing European philosophy in the early modern period, it is the Western world. When it starts picking itself up together and trying to understand what it should do or what values it should have to propel in the future, how to think about the never again, it is only one small piece, and certainly not only one small piece, but also a small, increasingly divided before the Iron Curtain piece, so that you have a situation which is an infinitesimally smaller portion of the universe than the one you are familiar with in your early modern period. So, having put all of these caveats, I wanted to try to also say that one of the reasons I wanted to reflect on this never again came from the fact that as a European and as a Jew, and the two are not in contradiction, at least not to my mind, I was always able to see and feel acutely some of the misunderstandings and the silences that took place, and the facility with which, if Europeans who were not Jewish commented on the Middle East or reflected on it, or if Jews or Israelis looked at Europe, it was very easy to fall into caricatures of accusing ones to be anti-Semitic or anti-Zionists, the others of being too nationalist, some of being forever eternally corrupt because of Europe that has no hope forward, others feeling that Israel somehow could not quite fully qualify as a mature democracy. I need not tell you more. I simply wanted to have a feeling that rather than hurling epithets at one another across given political issues, there was a legitimate way of looking at it in terms of almost political philosophy, if I can use this term, even though I'm not a philosopher, to say that how the Europeans see the world, and some of the conflicts linked to it, and how the Israelis and increasingly the Jews together, and I will go into this, see the world, are logical deductions from two incompatible, parallel, or anyway, reciprocal mirror image notions of the never again to World War II and the Holocaust. And as I do this, I will try to divide this in two manners. First of all, the immediate post-war period, and what I have come to increasingly perceive as the ever more complex and perhaps ultimately very destructive, if I may say so, return of the Holocaust into the Jewish world and into the Israeli context that took place in the 1990s. Holocaust 2 as a symbol, as a commemoration, as a reference, as a guiding light, if one can speak of darkness as a guiding light, and what the implications of that may be. We're dealing with mirror images, and the European Jews, in a sense, are the mirror image of the Israelis. And much of what Europe has done in the post-war period has been to create the kind of context in which the old European Jews of old, the ones before the Shoah, would have felt perfectly well at ease. But the new Jews after the Holocaust, not to mention the Israelis, would not have entered into this particular construction. And it is one of the tragedies, in a sense, of this situation that I would like to describe to you a bit more. So first of all, I don't want, John has asked, I'm waiting for your description and definition of Europe, so I will be very modest on this front, and I shall say that while the World War II was still being fought, Churchill had begun muttering something to the effect that something along European lines had to be built. And the thing that came out of this muttering was an institution I'm familiar with called the Council of Europe. It is not, I'm not here to present the Council of Europe, but I'm sorry to say that how it was based, the weaknesses it had, and the world vision that it had, conditioned and defined implicitly the never again of post-war Europe, and a never again that then trickled into the very low level kind of amorphous, incoherent notions that sometimes justify the European Union's understanding of what it should be doing with itself outside its own borders. 3 pillars to the Council of Europe: human rights, the rule of law, and democracy. These 3 pillars are precipitate, and I cannot give it to you, but you know it, of all the various elements of the great European philosophical tradition, and you can fill in the dotted lines in terms of where it comes from, whom. I can't, and it would be beyond the purview of what I'm saying, even if I could. All I want to say is that the Council was born in 1949, but that when it really took root, it was already a Council of Europe of an amputated Europe, since one half of Europe could not belong to it, and it was, of course, the half behind the Iron Curtain. So what was Winston Churchill's vision of a great council became, by definition, a Western European one, and not an entirely Western European one either, Spain and Portugal being left out as autocracies, dictatorships, Austria still being neutral and not having crawled out of it until 1955, the northern states arriving much later, so that we're talking about Charlemagne plus, because the UK was an absolutely important actor in it, and Germany was brought in very quickly, as a matter of fact, in 1950, I believe. Western Germany, of course. Now, why am I saying this? Because if some of you have been to Strasbourg or have entered the Council of Europe's corridors, there are several striking photos, and one of the most impressive one for me is the series of photos of the General Yearly Assembly of the Council of Europe, sitting in the front row, very much at home, like a sort of slightly exotic cousin, is David Ben-Gurion. He's not wearing a tie, you've got his great white bushy hair, but he's sitting there very much in the midst of all the other less, one almost forgets them, whether it's a Paul-Henri Spaak or whoever knows, the Adenauers, the Gasperis, who are sitting there as the creators of this new Europe before the coal and steel community that then would give birth to the European Union. He's just sitting there very informally in the front row, because it goes without saying that David Ben-Gurion and the little Israel he represents are just an inherent piece of the family. They're a little far away, but they're there, of course. David is part of the family. What I would like to stress, more importantly, is that David Ben-Gurion isn't just sitting there as what we could say a lonely Israeli in the middle of these European families, but in reality, given his pedigree, he's the only Eastern European there. He's the only person that comes out of a context of an ethnic nation state. Everybody else is incredibly Western European. The French, Luxembourgians, Belgians, but basically the prime movers of the Council of Europe are 2. France and the UK. Germany, for obvious reasons, is absent and silent, and no one is referring to Germany and its thinkers except in a very vague way about, the Rechtsstaat that was. But of course, we know what happened to it. So Ben-Gurion, unbeknownst to himself, represents with his ideas the other half of Europe, which will only appear in the Council of Europe halls after 1989, with its heavy baggage of ethnic understanding of national identity, with its heavy notions of minorities, with its very heavy burdens of the past. And it was my privilege and most fascinating experience of my life to spend 10 years winding and slaloming my way through the various arrivals of these various countries who had to clear ever higher obstacles to enter the Council of Europe before they could even begin to hope to be admitted inside the European Union. It all came very quickly, but still those were very important years to understand what was being conveyed. So when I now will speak to you about the notions of what the European never again was about, it was implicit after World War II, but it then became codified in an explicit manner, specifically after 1989, when one had to go out there and train or wash or purify or bring to the local level of democracy all those poor countries that had been deprived of it, and then, of course, the thorny matter of whether one should bring in the Russian bear or not. And the Russian bear was brought in, and there are other consequences that come from that, but this is not the purpose of what I want to say right now. So if you go to the origins of this, when I mentioned human rights, rule of law, and democracy, you can say that the British tradition, and here pardon me for my very grotesque, wide characterization of things, was a part of the rule of law and a certain input about individual rights. What did the French bring to this? Well, human rights, of course, la Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme and the French revolutionary tradition, plus a very important issue, which was ethnicity, God forbid. No ethnic identities, none of it around, and there was no one to contest the French on this front, since the other half of Europe was absent, and David Ben-Gurion was, coming from a little far away and had other things to worry about than to defend the notion of the ethnic states of Poland or Slovakia. So those were the bases. And so what did this happen? Here, I'll give it to you very rapidly. It's really 7 points that would qualify or define the European never again after World War II, and increasingly, especially in the 1990s, because everything came together. The wars in former Yugoslavia, the arrival of the countries with the ethnic nation state, and the floating back in of the Shoah. It all came like this incredibly complicated triple molecule and hit the placid waters of Strasbourg. Okay, the first never again to war, and I think many of these never agains will ring a bell immediately because I, having a double soul, could hear the silences and the tensions in our own conference over some of these never-agains that lie implicitly, conceptually, and are not linked to this politics or this particular situation or political context today. The first never-again, according to the Council of Europe, was a never-again to war. Consequently, Europe had had enough, and everything should be done to prevent any further war, of course, implicitly on the European continent. But the notion was that after World War II, there would be no more wars. And in the previous, some of the other sessions, we already had a moment in which I believe it was, I can't remember who it was right now, who said, well, this condition of not being in a state of war, I've never stopped. And so here's an example of the notion of the never again to war being sort of embedded into the European consciousness and not being embedded into another one, for instance, whether Israeli or into the wider world, including, of course, the United States. The second never again was a never again to ethnic and religious definitions of belonging to a state. Absolute equality of all citizens and the maximum rights for all residents. These, of course, I mean, it's quite obvious to understand, are almost mirror images of what the Nazis did and stood for. The third never again was to ethnic and religious cleansing and popular movements to achieve desired balances. In other words, there was a kind of implicit distrust of anything that would change borders or move people around. We're far from the 1922 accords between Greece and Turkey. The most important never again was never again to a Volksgesetz, that notion of any ethnically defined law that would turn anybody else in there who was not part of the ethnicity into structural pariahs. The fifth never again was the absolute never again to the Volksgesetz and its correlate, the absolute primacy of individual human rights over any national or collective rights. This was repeated and banged on day in and day out in the Council of Europe's proceedings in Eastern Europe after 1989. Collective religious or collective cultural rights only exist as emanations from individual rights. They have no transcendence of their own, nor any justification of their own inside the Council of Europe and, of course, the European Court of Human Rights that sits above it and that actually has a binding legal reality beyond pure kind words. Now, the right to religion, the right to culture, the right to a language are individual human rights put together as a bunch of individuals come together, with absolutely no transcendence. This implies full protection of the minorities, but also the minoritarian majority in any enclave. In other words, the Serbs in northern Kosovo have to be as protected as the Kosovars would have had to be ideally inside Yugoslavia. And all of this kind of, individual rights implies what is sort of implicit in this whole notion of the European never again, a growing secular space. Churches, yes, but not in too big a dose. Politics, yes. Identity, yes. Religion, ethnicity, hobbies, not main professional activities. The main professional activity would be to create a secular, open European space, which went as a call to ever stronger borderlessness and supranationality, of which the matrix was, of course, to be the Franco-German reconciliation. And all of this enshrined in the European Court of Human Rights, with ever stronger conventions binding countries one with another and taking on precedence over national identities. This European idée fixe with reconciliation, starting with the Franco-German one, and then moving after 89 to the German-Polish one, and then to the Lithuanian-Polish one, and so forth, and a kind of drang nach Osten of reconciliation, has become such an idée fixe that, as a correlate, I may say, most Europeans have only one desire: to reconcile the Israelis with the Palestinians, as though the Israelis and the Palestinians were the Germans and the French of and it only have happened after 1918. And one of the odd things about this, if there had only been a Franco-German reconciliation after World War I, there would have been German Jews to reconcile with French Jews. By the time the Franco-German reconciliation took place after World War II, there were no more Jews of any significant value to reconcile with the French equivalent, to create a kind of Judaism that would have gone beyond stupid national boundaries and been a motor of its own for a more civilized space. The final never again of Europe, citizenship as the linchpin of the system, with a citizenship that is open to anyone ultimately if he or she fulfills the rights and values incarnated in the Council of Europe, which of course the Council cannot decide how you become French or German, but that's the kind of zeitgeist in which people should be. And in which, and this is true of the European Court of Human Rights, residents, non-citizens, even passing people through the European space are entitled to present a request of problems or damages to Strasbourg. Consequently, a very blurred understanding of a citizen here, a resident, an immigrant, or a sojourner, or even a transient. Therefore, it's really an attempt to go beyond most of the classical notions of the nation state, the citizens, boundaries. In other words, it's the very opposite of the kind of Europe the Nazis had produced only 15 years before. No nationalist traditions, a kind of purified form, perhaps you would call it as experts, of a bourgeois liberalism. And one can make a point about this because there were no communist countries in it, and the socialists in Western Europe took a long time before they saw the Council of Europe as anything more than a bourgeois club of reactionaries who were anti-communists. It took them about 15 years to understand that there was something in there very much worthwhile. And by the time Spain came along and entered it in 1976, the left had entirely adhered, perhaps not the communist left, to this implicit notion and value of the Council. Now, let us turn to the other side, the other never again. If you turn to and I shall be very quick about this in the sense that not to the Israeli never again, but if you look at the Israeli definition of the identity, and I think we got a magnificent presentation by Professor Shalev this morning, there were several different pedigrees inside that one. There was the religious component, the nationalist one, even the far-right nationalist one that, of course, had been expurgated from the Council of Europe because it had, came from the devil's side. The corporativist, the trade unionist, the socialist, the communist, even the agrarian, which was roughly missing from. And all of these currents coexisted and mixed inside the Israeli identity. And before I turn to the sort of Israeli or Jewish never again, I would simply say that the irony of the European never again was that it created the kind of context that would have been seen as paradise by any Jew before the Holocaust, and certainly by any Jew living anywhere in Europe from the Enlightenment up to the 1930s. Any countries and a group of overarching countries that would have taken these positions on religion, minorities, identities, human rights, it would have been a kind of blessing, because of course it went without saying that people could retain their identity inside such an open wide space. But the Jewish never again to us arrived, the mirror image. And I would like to stress here that I'm talking about the Jewish Israeli never again to us together, although I'm acutely aware of the fact that Israel came out of a yishuv with a long pedigree before the Holocaust. And I'm here speaking more to the second coming of the Holocaust. I don't want to sound terribly Christian here. Not the return, the return of the Holocaust as commemoration and discovery that then transforms some of the givens. All right, so that's why I put them together. I'm quite aware that, as you said earlier, that the Israelis treated with scorn those idiots who survived the Holocaust, that they had it coming if they'd only arrived earlier, then so forth. All right, first, never again. Never again shall we let anyone else decide our fate. The Shoah transcends war. As the Lucy Davidovitz book said, it was the war against the Jews. The Jews were not just victims, among others, of World War II. They were destined for extermination as a very specific group. And of course, now you can make the point in the last 10 years since the Holocaust Declaration of 2000, we have now come to say, of course, there's the Roma, the homosexuals, and so forth and so forth. But for the major never again to us, the Shoah is so supreme that it transcends the notion of the end of war, or no more war, or we can all live together, or we can make negotiations. It somehow stands as an absolute, ultimate black Kantian imperative. The second one is that there be an imperative need for a Jewish state for the Jews and by the Jews, in which the collective rights of the Jews are primordial. And again, I think that Shalev was, clear very much. It was interesting this morning. The third definition, and I'm doing this in a very broad strokes. I'm aware that I'm saying things that require pages and pages of footnotes and qualifications. An ethnic and religious definition of belonging, stemming also from the fact that the majority of the creators of the State of Israel were coming from Eastern Europe, and therefore they had imbibed willy-nilly an Eastern European understanding of what a nation state was. which was, by Western European standards, whether French or British, a failed understanding of a embryonic failed understanding of what a proper nation state should be, and certainly not anything that anyone would have hoped would have come out of Trianon, or anyway Versailles. Anyway, so this image was not present in Western Europe. A fourth element, equality of citizens up to a point, the primacy of the Jewish character of the state, and only a very weak secular space. And this morning's Jerusalem Post says, Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people and all its citizens. And I would like you to imagine this as a Riga newspaper. Latvia is the nation state of the Latvians and all of its citizens, but kind of little parenthesis, and boy, they better learn how to speak Latvian, because we don't want to give them rights if they continue speaking Russian, really. And it's the Council of Europe that had to hammer it down into their throats. I'm being provocative here, but this is an example of the line here and how it can be read as, and not rightly so, may I add. So the borderlessness, well, first of all, not very possible, is it, here, to have a great borderlessness with one's neighbors? But more important, it would be inconceivable in the Israeli context of an understanding of the Jewish state to have supranationality or delegating sovereignty to abstract, very distant courts. And I think we had a very brilliant presentation about this in an attempt to walk away from the ICC in Amnon's presentation of today, which I find very, very important beyond just small Israeli issues as an understanding, and I will get back to that in a second. So individual human rights are crucial, but only one part of the equation inside the collective rights of the Jewish people and of the collective needs to survive and to be offered protection beyond my right as an individual Jew. I mean, I'm only giving here what is obvious, but I'm trying to show it to you schematically with respect to the other never again. The collective Jewish rights are political. It is a state, after all, so it's not cultural or linguistic. A state in which non-Jewish minorities are, if one looks at it brutally, somewhat structurally inferior. And it's not just an issue of the Arabs, but we mentioned previously the immigrants, all these hybrids and strange people who are now growing up with no claims whatsoever to really being inside if you're from Thailand, and what will happen to them. And I'm using here the references with respect to the old never again. The lack of a neutral collective space or its relative weakness, whereas it sort of is implicitly supposed to be the federating strength of the European project. But I will be very critical of the European project everywhere, so don't worry, I'm not creating a glorious never again and a second-hand never again to us issue at all. I don't want to be misunderstood on this front. The state is Jewish, and in a sense, Israel is conceptually imagined as the mirror image of the kind of ideal never-again nations post-war Europe should have been building, and perhaps which maybe Germany did its very best to try to resemble. Now, what I'm saying about this is that if you looked at the term rule of law, and I have argued this urbi et orbi, if I may be allowed another Christian little piece here, I'm Italian, don't forget, is that I dare anyone to find a country like Israel in the situation in which it's in to have a Supreme Court the way it has had, in terms of the ability to carry through, ponder, protect, and reflect on burning issues with a kind of detachment that one associates with a calm Swiss countryside. So from that point of view, at any rate, the rule of law, and of course I'm not here to tell you, I'm only here to give you the distinctions, the conceptual distinctions, but the lines get perfectly muddled, otherwise we would be talking of some kind of, I don't know, completely ethnic other state. in the middle of nowhere, and it's not point. Now, what are the problems with the misunderstandings? And this is what I want to get to, because they're very, very heavy. Europe feels that it's done its best to change itself bottom up, and we're not talking about the fact that there might be extreme right-wingers here and there or the Arab problem, but certainly there is no state across Europe today that, or those inside the European Union, that has practiced state anti-Semitism, which is of course where the horror came from, and not by individual pogroms here and there. I mean, Germany produced what 1 million or 20 million anti-Semitic Poles could never have done, even if they had individually clobbered 5 Jews apiece. It would not have been sufficient. So, how do Europeans consider the problem, and where do they misunderstand the issue of the Jewish never again to us? Well, first of all, they think that European never again is probably loftier, and they think that the Jewish Europe never again to us is more particular. I'm not sure it is. And they consider, and this I do want to stress because I think it lies at the heart of many a misunderstanding, the Europeans consider, in the basis of having David Ben-Gurion sitting amongst them in the front row, that Israel is a European country living in a very bad neighborhood. And some of them have reached the point of saying, it's just getting worse and worse, maybe you should move out, but of course you can't move out with the Israeli state in your suitcase. Then move out and become Jews amongst us again, and we love you, and we lack, wits hasn't been the same in Germany since we destroyed you, and this and that and so forth. I am only half joking, having heard sentences of this nature being told to me, literally in front of me, about how, look, you're so civilized, you can't possibly stay in that neighborhood, kind of thing, The real estate market is really going down there. So what are we dealing with here? Since they consider Israelis as Europeans living somewhere else, they think that Israelis should be still carrying the European never again in them. Granted, yes, there was the Shoah, it's horrible, but now look at the miracles you've done, and at some point in some distant future, your never again to us and our never again will meet and fall in love with each other, and there'll be just one never again forever. So what happens? The break about Europe over 1967 in Israel is not a break about, General de Gaulle wanting to sell more arms to the Arabs or having a new Arab policy. Of course that counted, but it was the notion of Israel, and no one listened to the triple no of Khartoum when the Israelis wanted to give back the lands to get recognition, and the Arab countries said no. There's this notion of, my goodness, how can Israel be occupying the lands of another people? It's a very crude, materialistic notion of, we've said no to war, we don't occupy anybody's lands anymore, we are going against the war. So this is the first misunderstanding. Just get out of those lands and everything will be fine. The Jewish nature of the state is something that most Europeans sort of understand, but not really, and they have a hard time with it, and articles like this don't make it easier.
So do we.
Okay. So, I noticed that, but for Europeans that are so secular, unlike the Americans, this is a real problem. Why can't you have a state in which you've got everybody, and isn't that the new, united colors of Benetton? This is really what the future is about. The secondary rights of populations that were always there strikes at the very core of the Council of Europe program. And also, how can you not give these secondary rights to those people out there when you suffered so much? And we in Europe now have understood and are making sure that, even 2 Jews somewhere, I don't know, in Macedonia will be perfectly protected beyond their numerical strength. Fourth, human rights have to be primordial, not collective rights. Consequently, when we talk about the collective rights of Jews and the Jewish people and coming back and the Jewish peoplehood, this is something that grates terribly against, and people are very polite and often don't say it, but sometimes the truth comes out. Wait a minute, we're all individual rights, we're all individual human beings. Please don't give us this notion of a Jewish peoplehood that would allow someone from Kansas City to move in, or someone from Russia, whereas the poor Palestinian can't cross border A to B because of the wall, and he's been there for time immemorial. I'm being blunt, but this is one of the lack of secular and civil spaces. You mean you can't get married in a civil marriage? You have to go through, you have to go to Larnaca? And where is that anyway? Cyprus? Why are you going to Cyprus to get married? This is crazy. You know, we've had Napoleon got rid of that, and the French Revolution is sort of this moment of silence of, you've really slipped backwards, and you who used to be so avant-garde as Jews. War as an overkill to achieve other aims. I don't have to say anything more. I think that what we lived through as a moment with Marco and Daniel was a very important moment earlier this afternoon, in which you could almost see full color, full living color, the two never-agains not dialoguing with each other, because there was no way, and the Israeli position and reaction being entirely because of the never-again to us. And this brings us, and I should say this again, most Americans or Jewish advocates of Israel will talk about Darfur and why are you picking on Israel only? Look at the horrible things, you know, Pol Pot did to the Cambodians and the Somalians to them. I said the whole planet. And the Europeans remain stone cold because Israel is European in their minds, and therefore Israel is the only place where a white man does nasty things today. And of course it is to be assumed that Arabs are primitive and are doing horrible things to each other, and Africans, you know, chopping off arms of another African tribe. So the more Jews talk about the horrors elsewhere, the more it doesn't ring a bell, because boy had the Europeans learned that the Jews were Europeans and part of themselves, because after having exterminated them on the fact that they were not. Now the notion is they are. How can you possibly, you know, you can't do this. South Africa has come out of this, and so people say, well, if only Arafat had been Mandela and so forth. But the point is that there's just no, it's a mind warping exercise, and the more you bring out horror in the other parts of the world, the European response is to not understand. We're Europeans, right? And the Hebraics were there in the 17th century, right? And the Bible was around, and we really should have been the ultimate Europeans, and we're no longer there in massive amounts to turn ourselves as Jews as the kings of the European cosmopolitan identity. So, the weakness of citizenship, again. How do you become? Can you just arrive as a Thai, work in your fields, live for 5 years, learn Hebrew, and understand what the holidays are about, so that you know you don't throw a big dinner party on Kippur and that kind of thing, and then claim to become an Israeli citizen? No. But that is certainly what most Europeans are trying to make as a point with respect to the Turks in Germany, the Arabs in France, the Pakistanis in the UK, the Moroccans in the Netherlands. That's considered to be the proper avant-garde of thought on that front. And for obvious reasons, I don't think Thais will become Israelis very quickly. And then this ocean of the impossibility of adhering to the national compact if one is the other, and I won't go beyond that. Of course, we've been talking about this from the word go. So these are the implicit moral tones of amazement, silence, silent condemnation, but we don't dare say it, and the silence is ever less silent and ever more strident. And there's another reason for this, which I would call the perverse effects from a Jewish point of view of the return of the Holocaust commemoration. What do I mean by this? When the Council of Europe was created and most of post-war Europe was, you know, moving ahead, including the Jews who were rebuilding lives, there was a very nice, interesting way of saying that the Hitlerites or the Nazis had been responsible for the horror, which left everybody else off the hook except very dark gray Poland because of its anti-Semitism. And I've made the comparison that the Germans had a meningitis of 12 years, the Poles have had a malaria of 1,000. But that is more or less how the two countries are perceived in the Jewish geography, mental geography. So the Germans got out of their meningitis, the temperature came down, and slowly but surely they could become fitting partners. Whereas the Poles with malaria, it comes and goes, quinine is available, but it's not always there, these are the problems. Okay. Now, why do I say this? Because when the Holocaust comes back, it comes back with a historical truth, which was that there wasn't a bunch of 15 Hitlerites and a bunch of good Germans who didn't know what was happening just following orders. But slowly and surely, all the historical research has proven to what an extent all of Europe was, in one way or another, complicit with the extermination of the Jews. The one taking driving the trains if you were Polish, the Bousquets and Papons of France, the Swedes and their, without whose steel the German war effort could not go forward, the little Swiss with their bank accounts, you name it. There wasn't a country that was spared in what I call the graying of Europe via Holocaust II, the commemoration. Now this has a consequence, because before that you could say my father was a resistor, my parents did nothing, somebody else was a murderer, and then whatever. All of a sudden we've created a category in Holocaust studies called the Opfer, the victims, the perpetrators, and a third category called the bystander. The bystander is everybody. It's everybody's grandfather and grandmother, aunt and uncle. Very few could claim to have actually had resistors in their pedigree. Once you create the Holocaust as being the monstrosity of all over Europe, then it's something that you should have been able to stop implicitly early on by doing this or by doing that or by not doing this or by not doing that, if you're going to be bystanders. Or what is the consequence? Well, it was terrible. Our ancestors were all involved in some way, shape, or form by error of omission. It becomes all over the place, and then all of a sudden you see Israel behaving in ways that are complicated. And the result is, well, if we were all gray, so are you, Israelis. You too are a bit gray. You too have problems. You too, that photo of the man demanding for the documents like this. So without entering the craziness of the notion of Israel equal SS, which is absolute horror, what was happening is, if every single European, in a sense, was complicit with the horror that came in various shapes, sizes, then you too, as Israelis, are also involved, not in a Holocaust, of course, but in a situation in which you might be taking more important stands with respect to the same never-again values which we be both cherishing. And it's this rubbing off of the Holocaust. The more you extend it like an oil spill, the more then others want to make sure that the rest of humanity is covered as well, because it's a very heavy load to bear on one's shoulders. And that is one of the implicit consequences. You're not doing anything but look at what's happening in the checkpoints. Why are you not, saying something? It's not a Holocaust, and it's not ethnic cleansing, and it's not genocide, but, they're beginnings to things. I'm, again, putting myself in the shoes of many a European looking at this, having to know that the lessons of the Holocaust were such that, Anne Frank was, after all, turned in by a Dutch person. And the Dutch 90% of the Dutch Jews did disappear then it brings you back to France, which is a very different case. After having gone through all the blackness of Vichy, then you wake up one morning and Simone Veil is on television saying, wait a minute, 75% of the French Jews were saved. Should we perhaps not start making innuendos or, stratifications? So these are the, how can I say this? This is a kind of consequences of the never again as perceived in the European context, which of course says that the new Europe is not the old one. If you look at it from the never again to us of Israel, the horror hasn't gone away, it has only increased, and the typical notion of Israel being the Jew among nations does not help in not producing an ever more strong never again to us. And what happens then is that you have a situation whereby Israel defends itself in its behavior and identity, in a very interesting, and this is where it becomes relevant to understand how can one ever really reconcile these two never-agains. Israel defends itself by looking out into the wider world. So it is, of course, Asia, Darfur, but even more to the point, it goes into what we can call the realpolitical. Life is tough and decisions must be made and the state must protect its citizens, and we don't give a hoot about this blurry European space. What is it worth? How many divisions does it have? To paraphrase Stalin. The real world out there, what was the name of that famous thing Kagan wrote, of Paradise and Power? So yeah, the Europeans are into Venus and never-agains, mushy, lovely rhetoric, regretting the Jews of the past, in love with Stefan Zweig, and to be, or Levinas Marco, as the Israelis might say. Levinas is good for European souls, but irrelevant to us in Israel. And we are out there against the barbarians. Now, there are only two ways to this. How can they be reconciled? It would be unfair. At one point I would have said, well, it would be through the civil societies, but my Italian half, or third or fourth of me, realizes that civil society can be a very black actor itself, as Marco also pointed out, and that civil society coming to power, as was the case in Poland, created more chaos than one could have imagined, and that's not the solution. So I see two possible outcomes. The first is rosy, and I'll give it to you first because it's shorter and probably less likely. The first is rosy. It's, well, Israel and Palestine will get to the two-state solution. They may even have minorities on both sides, so that all those wonderful extremists in Hebron can now be Palestinian citizens, and Israel can go back to its moderate, delicate, intellectual, proud, and pioneer self. And then that way, you know, there's going to be a Palestinian-Israeli reconciliation, and boy, will the Europeans bring piles and tons of champagne, I mean.
And money.
And money. They will be just, you know, there'll be a great blessing, and there'll be, you know, the 12 stars will be put around the heads of whoever's the Prime Minister of Israel and of Palestine, who will have signed this final agreement. And in this rosy notion, Israel can return, with Palestine tagging along, of course, into the fold of the great European Kantian space of perpetual peace. The black one, the black scenario, is, and I was impressed by Marco's reflection, when a very elegant way of taking on Gadi's critique of Israel by saying that these are problem. Gadi's,
no,
yes.
Gadi
Al-Ghazi's, yes. Critique of moving it up into a much wider context will be, no, it's not Europe. I mean, it's not Israel holding the hand of little Palestine that is moving into Europe. It's Europe that's going to be moving into the chaos of the barbarian world. And the very pessimists, of course, won't even call it Europe. They will call it Eurabia. And more to the point, the nation states will close up. They will build barriers. They will become much more exclusive and straitjacketed. They will make Lieberman-like demands on their own citizens. And Europe will become very much more like Israel, and therefore there will be a kind of fusing together of the never-agains, but it will be along the line of a never-again to us Western civilized people with all of these, you know, monstrously dangerous people around us. And I can't tell you right now which never again will rise above the other, for the simple reason that the Europe I see unfolding before me is not exactly the Europe I might have dreamt of in 1989, or with the power, or with the will, and the recent nomination of the enlightened, charismatic, powerful new president of Europe, and his equally brilliant, experienced, and world-wise Ministry of Foreign Affairs, is not made to encourage me further along those lines, but who never knows, one can have miracles there too. But the point is that we are in a world in which the never again to us is also full of three other connotations. The colonial one, we haven't come out to understand exactly when, how the colonial countries react and whether they'll accept the magnanimous European notion of the never again, or they're still going to be festering with their own never again to us. Certainly Algeria, with respect to France, is not a very promising possibility. Then you will have the others, those lovely BRICS, Brazil, India, China, Russia, sort of parenthesis, countries that are very clear in their national identity, their desires, their priorities, their collective identities. And why on earth should Israel measure itself with respect to decadent, unemployment-laden, fatigued Europe, which, with all respect to the Swiss here, some people feel will become a Magna Helvetia, when the future, in terms of Hegelian terms, might be precisely China, Brazil, and India, whose understanding of what a nation is about can be much closer to the us, our interests, and our future. So I can't tell you more. All I can say simply, and I want to wish to end with this, is that the two never-agains are not compatible. They're mirror images. I hope they can fuse in a more positive manner together. The only reason I developed them as such was that it was my small attempt to make sure that the rushing around of anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic labels, imperialist labels, all the kind of absurd labels that float around with the help also of American Jewry and Israelis against Europe, and of the European silence and misunderstandings, have a much more theoretical basis than simply ill will.